Now, I don't think this is the best Canadian Grand Prix that we've ever seen, but it definitely was not the worst. I really feel like these new regulations are providing some excellent racing. Now, everybody's giving a lot of credit for the aero regulations to let the cars follow a lot more closely, but I don't think that's the only thing at play here. We actually need to give a little bit of credit to Pirelli this time. These tires are allowing the drivers to push flat out for 10 plus laps, making some pretty exciting racing. Now, couple this with the aero regulations, and I think we've got a recipe for success for this season. Now, the only disappointment I will say for the spectacle of racing this season is the performance gap between the teams, but that's always going to happen when we introduce new regulations. Some teams go forwards and some teams go backwards. Now, it is just a matter of time before Mercedes bridge the gap to the front, and hopefully we can see the rest of the midfield up their game as well. My name is Blake, and welcome to Break F1. I spent 10 years in Formula 1 as a performance engineer at the track and in the simulator. Now I'm making analytical YouTube content to share what I've learned about Formula 1 data analysis with you. Now, I also stream live race watch-alongs and these performance analysis sessions live over on Twitch. If that's your thing, I've left a link down below. Come say Pedro Gaseoso. I'll know you're from YouTube. So let's dig into the Canadian Grand Prix. Now, I've got to say, I absolutely love a wet qualifying session. It always shakes up the grid and gives us a few pleasant surprises and some not so pleasant ones. As far as the race itself goes, there is so much to look into. We've got strategy, we've got pace, we've got tires, got overtaking, we've got an inability to overtake. There's so much going on, so let's dig into it. Thanks to a mixture of safety cars and virtual safety cars, we had what most people probably wanted to be a one-stop race, converting that into a two-stop race that was pretty easy. Now, just over half of the grid favored the hard over the medium, but Perez and Leclerc starting out of position favored the hard for the race start, whereas almost everybody else started on the medium. After this, everything settled down quite a bit. That being said, this probably added a lot of question marks over the medium tire, which a lot of people started on. What was the longevity? What was the actual pace of this tire? That was probably pretty difficult for teams to figure out. Both Lewis and Max got off of this tire after only 9 laps, but several of the other midfield runners fit the medium tire for their final stint. One of the main reasons most people ran 2 hards in the race instead of 2 mediums was because most of them only had 1 medium tire, and a lot of them started on that tire. So that gets rid of some of the question marks like why Sainz didn't fit a medium or Max didn't fit a medium in the final stint of the race, but we'll get back to that. Personally, I was pretty excited to see Lewis back on the podium, but does this mean Mercedes are back in the fight? I've got both some good news and some bad news. The good news is we have so much clean air data from both Verstappen, Sainz, Hamilton, and Russell, so we can get a good idea of where these guys are at in terms of pace. For the most part, the safety cars gave us a situation where the drivers didn't have to watch tires or fuel, so we can actually trust the pace data that we're observing in this race. Now, the bad news is I don't think Mercedes are back in the fight just yet. Yes, they showed some positive signs this weekend, but there's still a long way to go in my opinion. Hopefully this will make that statement a little bit more clear. In terms of Mercedes' race this weekend, I think they did get the most out of the car and the strategy. Both Mercedes drivers ran a 2-stop medium hard, with Hamilton taking the first VSC stop here and Russell taking the second VSC stop. Both drivers were having pretty reasonable pace on their hard tires in this stint, with Russell even closing up to Hamilton on the end of a 20-lap old hard tire. You can see him closing the gap right here a little bit. Now, at the end of the race, Lewis also flexing a little bit with the lap times, holding on to the Verstappen and Sainz tram before falling back just a little bit to come home in third. But how does this pace stack up against the Red Bull and the Ferrari? So here's the lap times throughout the race for all the drivers. So we're not looking at gaps anymore. We're just looking at their actual lap times. Towards the end of the second stint, Mercedes holding on very reasonable lap times where you can see both the Red Bull and the Ferrari getting a little bit of degradation. And this second hard stint, Mercedes pulling out some reasonable lap times for roughly similar tire ages. And after the safety car here, we can see Lewis with some pretty impressive laps, matching the Verstappen and Sainz train. Unfortunately, it looks like he drops off a little bit and then ends up matching Russell's lap times at the end of the final stint. Let's look at these stint paces and try to rank them and compare how far the Mercedes are potentially to the Red Bull and the Ferrari. This is the average fuel-corrected pace on each stint. Realistically, I think the Mercedes are about 0.5% off on each stint of the same tire. I think there's a pretty reasonable guesses at stint pace considering all the drivers had pretty roughly similar stint lengths. For the most part, most of the drivers were pushing, taking full advantage of the VSC and safety car, so they had no concerns with fuel or tires. Looking through the data, you can see Lewis's hard stint 3 was comparable to stint 1 on the mediums for the Red Bulls, so there's about 0.5% gap between the Ferrari Red Bull versus the Mercedes. I think we can kind of tell from the comments from Lewis and Toto in the press that the Mercedes team have kind of designed themselves into a little bit of a corner with the W13, and this is just going to take them time to get the car figured out. But this was a pretty interesting and entertaining race, despite Mercedes being in a little bit of no man's land between the front runners and the rest of the midfield. That being said, this puts them in an excellent position to capitalize on both Red Bull and Ferrari mistakes, which they did quite well this event. Now, speaking of Ferrari misfortune, let's see what happened to Leclerc during his race. So Leclerc started P19 due to taking an engine penalty, drives through the field, and ends up finishing P5. I was really thinking that we'd see Leclerc on the podium after this, but it just wasn't meant to be. And let's try and figure out why. Whereas most drivers in this race started on a medium, Leclerc, starting from the back, decides to go with a hard. He quickly makes his way through the field until lap 20 when he pulls up on Ocon. At this point, Ocon has just pit for a new hard tire, and Leclerc's on a 20-lap old hard that has come through half of the field. So, despite having quite a bit of pace in hand that you can see here, Leclerc does not stand a chance of overtaking Ocon, and let's try to understand why not. Now, looking at lap times instead of race gaps, we can learn a little bit more about this. So, after the pit stop at lap 20, Ocon's easing in his new hard tire as Leclerc's coming out and starts pushing quite hard. Now, as soon as Leclerc comes up on the back of Ocon, Ocon puts the hammer down and does not let him pass. So let's look into some lap telemetry and understand what Ocon was doing that gave him such an advantage to hold Leclerc in a much faster car behind him. So let's look at this. This is lap 24 before Leclerc gets the DRS on Ocon. So we've got Leclerc in green and Ocon in pink. This is what it looks like when Leclerc has 1 second of pace advantage in hand. And let's see where that Ferrari's faster. For the most part, Leclerc is stronger on the brakes into turn 8, into turn 10, and into the final chicane of turn 13. For the rest of the lap, the Alpine is not too bad. Of course, Ocon is on 20-lap newer tires, but there's still something to learn from this. Now, this isn't a super low drag, low downforce Alpine that we've seen before. I think they've actually put some downforce and drag in order to be competitive this weekend. I'd say Leclerc, if you're looking at these straight line speeds here on the green, Leclerc definitely has some pace in hand in a straight line, and he's very good on the brakes. Honestly, looking at this, I would say Leclerc should be able to pretty easily overtake Ocon, but let's see what happens when he pulls up on the back. So here we've got lap 26. Again, Ocon in pink and Leclerc in the green. For the most part, this snapshot tells you exactly why Leclerc could not overtake him. So for the first half of the lap, Ocon typically can pull about half a second on Leclerc. Because Leclerc is following, he cannot use the full advantage of his brakes to get up behind him. Look at this. So he's having to brake earlier here, he's having to brake earlier here, and he's really slowing the car down and focusing on getting a good exit out of these corners. But even then, he's still only making up all the lap time that he's lost all the way up to turn 10, and he gains that back on the DRS, but he just doesn't really stand a chance to get around Ocon. Realistically, this is what 26-lap old hard tires look like versus nearly brand new hards. As I said, we can see Leclerc slowing the car down and rotating and trying to focus on the exits, but it's just not enough to overtake Esteban. So let's see what that means for the rest of his race. Leclerc is tired of being stuck behind Ocon, and at lap 40, he pits for his final set of new medium tires, which will take him to the end of the race. Fortunately for everybody else, here we've got Tsunoda causing the full safety car, and everybody gets bunched back up. With this newer medium, he sails straight through Ocon and Alonso and brings the car home in P5 just behind Russell. Now, a lot of people are wondering, if Leclerc could have gotten past Ocon, would he have stood a chance to race the Mercedes or even get on the podium? Looking at Leclerc's pace and clean air before he approaches Ocon, I think he probably would have been able to pull up to the Mercedes in this stint, and he possibly would have been able to go a little bit longer on that hard without battling so hard behind Ocon. I think he had a little bit of pace in hand over Russell, but Russell not doing too bad at the end of this hard stint either in terms of pace compared to Lewis. Realistically, if Leclerc hadn't gotten stuck behind Ocon, I think P4 would have been pretty easy for him, but looking at Russell's pace, I'm not sure that he would have made it too easy for Leclerc to get past him. Now, we've talked about Ocon and Leclerc quite a bit. Let's talk about why El Plan turned into Alpine for Fernando. So Alonso starts on the front row next to Max due to a spectacular wet qualifying performance on Saturday. But his race was pretty strange. There are a few things to unpack here. For example, what was up with his strategy? And it also sounded like he had some issues with his car which were costing him over 1 second per lap. What actually happened? Let's dig into it. Now, let's look at the first half of the race from the race driver gaps, focusing on Alonso and the front of the field, as well as Ocon. We can see after the race start, Alonso falls behind Sainz pretty quickly, but he is able to hold on, while Max pulls a gap to Sainz. But after the first VSC here, Alonso seems to lose a lot of pace. Now, Alonso said he had some reliability issues which cost him a bit of lap time, but let's have a look at that and see what we can find out. Now, this is lap 7 before the first virtual safety car. This is Sainz in pink and Alonso in green. Basically, Alonso can match Sainz's lap time as long as he's got the DRS. Through the first half of the lap, Sainz is gaining about a half a second. Then after turn 10 with the DRS straight, Alonso gains all that lap time back. So the big question is, what happens after the VSC? Why does Alonso fall off? Now, here's a little bit of a different comparison. This is Alonso on lap 7 in pink, which we just saw, and Alonso on a lap 11 after the virtual safety car in green. You can see that Alonso has lost the DRS, but it looks like most of the lap time that he's losing is just in the DRS zones. It doesn't seem like he's bleeding time anywhere else. He's faster on the brakes into turn 10 without having to worry about Carlos ahead. There's nothing really to stand out. Like, if it's energy management or something else, it doesn't look like he's losing that much time. This looks like just DRS losses. Let's just check one more thing just so we're sure that nothing's crazy wrong, because I heard some people throwing around numbers like he was losing a second a lap after the virtual safety car, which I don't think is the case. Now, here's Alonso and Ocon on lap 13. Ocon in pink and Alonso in green. Honestly, I don't see anything substantial going on here. Maybe at the end of the lap, Alonso has a little bit more clipping or less electrical energy available here, but I mean, if you look at how much lap time this is costing hundredths of a second, not even tenths, and nowhere close to an entire second of lap time. Through the corners, he's just losing a little bit of time on the brakes into 6, 7, and 8, 9, but nothing crazy. Also, Alonso getting a great exit out of the final corner. I'm not too sure what's going on here, honestly. Let's look at one more thing. If you ask me what happened here with Alonso, looks like exactly what we saw with Perez in Baku at the start of the race. What do you mean? Let me explain. Here's the first 30 laps of the race. We've got Verstappen, Sainz, Ocon, and Alonso. From the start of the race, we've got a very green track and the drivers are improving their lap times. And you can see Alonso here. Look how fast he's going for that Alpine. He's matching the Red Bull and the Ferrari lap times early on that. Now here we have this VSC, and after the VSC, Alonso seems to take a huge hit in lap time. But at this point, he's on the same age tires as Ocon. Obviously, he's put in a lot more work on a lot faster for the first 6 or 7 laps. And at this point on same age tires, he's going the same pace as Ocon. Looking at the data, I don't see anything in terms of energy deployment that's costing him a load of lap time. I think simply Alonso has blown these tires up. Now, honestly, here you can see Ocon pits for new hards and Alonso degging off. Realistically, this looks like tire degradation. This doesn't look like anything suspicious, but it was a pretty reasonable stint. However, this asks us some other questions. Why did they leave Alonso out for so long on this dying tire? We'll get back to that. So after the final safety car period, Alonso finds some pace and he's able to hold up onto the back of Ocon. Nothing weird going on here at all. We see Leclerc come through to finish 5th. Ocon and Alonso crossing the line in 6th and 7th. Now, a lot of people are saying Alonso had a pretty terrible strategy and they screwed him over. Let's see what we can see about that. I think I've got an answer. So I think we agree it doesn't look like Alonso had any massive issues with his car. So let's look at what's going on with his strategy. From what I can tell, it looks like Alpine was dead set on one-stopping Alonso. Now, this is the most disappointing part about Alonso's race. They really just leave him out on a dying soft, chasing the one stop. I mean, I know it's perfect hindsight here, but this stop was super free and they could have easily covered Russell. I mean, of course, they didn't know Russell was going to stop. Ultimately, the stopping here puts him back behind Leclerc and Ocon, and that is the order in which they finish. Unfortunately, I do believe it was Alpine that turned El Plan into El Pain. Now, here's the part that most of you guys have probably been waiting for. The Verstappen versus Sainz battle. Let's break it down. In all honesty, I think the Ferrari was the faster race car this weekend. And from the drivers' interviews, I think both Max and Carlos agree on this one. Now, most weekends, Carlos is always just a little bit off of Leclerc, which makes me really wonder, how fast is that Ferrari really? Would Leclerc have won this race? We can only speculate, but let's have a look at what happened between Verstappen and Sainz. Now, looking at lap times between Verstappen and Sainz, there is not too much between them. But realistically, I do believe the Ferrari was the faster car outright this weekend. It just didn't work out for them. Max got track position in the final stint and did not even give Carlos a chance to sniff the top step of that podium. Now, clearly in this final stint here, you can see that Verstappen's pace really dictated what Sainz was able to do. He just couldn't get past. We saw with Ocon and Leclerc that even a slower car can hold you up if you don't have an advantage that's substantial enough here. Now, before we look at why Sainz couldn't overtake Verstappen, let's look at what happened before the final stint. So here's the race trace with Max and Carlos highlighted. We can see that Max pulls off into the distance on the first stint, but comes in pretty early on this first VSC to put on a new hard. I don't think they were getting on with that medium tire very well at all. Carlos goes longer on his first medium and takes the second virtual safety car to come out also on a new hard. That drops him quite a bit behind Max. It does look like he lost quite a bit of time with this stop as well, which was unfortunate for him. Now, through the second stint, despite the tires being a little bit newer, Sainz is a little bit faster on this hard, but it looks like he reaches a similar amount of degradation at a similar time as Verstappen does. Now, on lap 42, Verstappen stops for a new hard, as he's got a clear window over Hamilton. At the end of lap 49, there's a full-blown safety car for Tsunoda, who has a little bit of a brain fart and drives into the barriers. So a last-minute call for Ferrari, and they come in to fit Carlos on some new hards, which drops him just behind Verstappen coming out of the pits. Realistically, the Ferrari had no choice but to stop here. I mean, look at the degradation that he's already getting on this tire. I do not think this hard tire was going to last to the end. Now, we've got the safety car over, and the race is on. Now, why couldn't Carlos overtake Max? Now, this wasn't like Jeddah where the Red Bull was insanely fast in a straight line. I think both the Ferraris and the Red Bulls in terms of straight line speed without DRS were quite well matched. And in terms of outright pace, I think the Ferrari was a faster car. But even with DRS, Carlos could not get past Max. Now, we've got lap 65 with Verstappen in pink and Sainz in green. You can see Carlos is matching Max's lap time, and a lot of that time is coming back from the DRS. So Max very strong on the brakes into turn 1, into 3, into 6, into 8, and into 10. By lap 10, Max has made up half a second on Carlos. But at the exit of turn 10 with the DRS, Carlos is making up a lot of lap time. And by 13, the final chicane, he's getting close, but he cannot even make a move on him. They are pushing flat out, using all the track, going as hard as they possibly can to the end of the race. Now, realistically, this is what it looks like when you have a similarly paced car. Even with the DRS advantage, you still need quite a substantial pace advantage to get around another car, even if you can do about the same lap times, even with DRS. Honestly, the end of the race was pretty exciting, and this is the kind of racing that we deserve. Now, I still can't help but wonder, what if Leclerc was in that Ferrari? Would the race have ended differently? Either way, Carlos had a great weekend, and he deserves all the credit for bringing the Ferrari home in P2. So there we have it. Those are my highlights from the Canadian Grand Prix. If you enjoy these race breakdowns, be sure to check out some of my other race analysis videos. I'll see you guys in Silverstone.